Hello everyone. Lovely to see you here tonight. I'm Chris and this is Jo. We're from PEN Melbourne. Today I firstly want to say that we're meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, whose elders I pay my respects to and whose enduring sovereignty of country, water and land has never been ceded. For this acknowledgement to actually mean anything, we're required to act. PEN Melbourne supports the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the call for voice, treaty, truth. When the referendum comes along, as it will, and we're very hopeful, we'll be voting yes, and I hope that you'll consider your vote very carefully. It will change our nation. There's no doubt about it. PEN International acknowledges the International Day of the Imprisoned Writer each year. We have an ongoing and creative partnership with the Wheeler Centre. The Wheeler Centre, a centre of books, writing and ideas in Melbourne, which is a UNESCO City of Literature. This feels like the hub of it all, whenever we come here. It's so good to be at the Wheeler Centre. They bring energy and practical support to our important work for writers here and around the world. PEN Melbourne works to defend writers and writing and to promote literature. In the words of our charter, literature knows no frontiers and must remain common currency among people in spite of political or international upheavals. Today is the International Day of the Imprisoned Writer, and our focus will be utterly on Mr. Julian Assange. I won't say any more about him now, but Jo will follow up and we'll spend the night learning about him and thinking of him. But I will mention a PEN International woman, someone that we're very concerned about today, Narges Mohammadi, an Iranian writer, journalist, human rights defender. She's been in prison untold times under terrible conditions in Iran, which don't get any better. So today we also remember her. And if you're interested in Narges' case, there's some printed materials at the back of the room explaining the ordeals she's been through and what you can do to take action for her. I'll hand over to Jo to do the empty chair.
PEN International advocates on behalf of writers who are silenced for carrying out the peaceful practice of their profession. They are often the truth tellers. They speak out against injustice, and they do this knowingly risking their freedom and, in the worst cases, their lives. They care about the truth and the public's right to know. Each year, PEN campaigns for hundreds of writers around the world who are unjustly harassed, imprisoned, tortured, murdered with impunity in order to suppress the injustices which their writing brings to light. The number of such writers facing dire punishments is increasing, along with the growth of authoritarian regimes. Truth-telling is dangerous. The PEN empty chair is for the writer who cannot be with us, Julian Assange, an Australian journalist and publisher, the founder of WikiLeaks. Tonight, Julian Assange is incarcerated in Belmarsh prison, the UK's highest security prison, where he has been held in cruel confinement for more than 3 years now. For his truth-telling in the public interest, Julian Assange faces a US prison sentence of up to 175 years. And as Julian is the subject of tonight's conversation, you'll hear the details of his case from those who are closest to him. Nils Melzer, UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, has said that this is a case of political persecution, and PEN believes that it sets a dangerous precedent for all media, publishers and journalists. PEN urges the Australian government to intervene at the highest level with their UK and US counterparts to free Julian Assange. Join the campaign to stand in solidarity with the peacemakers and truth-tellers like WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange. Thank you.
Thanks, Jo. So let's begin. I'm going to introduce Rachael Brown, and we're so pleased that you could come along tonight, Rachael. Rachael will lead this conversation. She's an investigative journalist with the ABC. She's held several postings, including European correspondent from 2010 to 2013, during which time she covered Julian Assange's extradition hearing. She's the creator, investigator and host of the ABC's pioneer true crime podcast, Trace. Rachael's review of the 1980 cold case of Maria James, which sparked a new coronial inquest, and she published a book on the case. Trace 2, The Informer, tells the story of defence barrister turned informer Nicola Gobbo. Rachael is a 3-time Walkley Award winner. She currently reports for the ABC's Background Briefing podcast, and Rachael will guide us through this evening conversation, looking closely at the case of Julian Assange. Welcome, Rachael and John Shipton.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I might be doing a bit of freestyling, so bear with me. I'll be calling Julian Assange's father, John Shipton, up shortly. We're also hoping to speak to Stella Assange, his wife. We understand she's on her way to Belmarsh prison to visit Julian this morning UK time, so we're trying to see if we can grab her while she's in the car, so I might be jumping around a little bit, so I apologise in advance for that. But first, I wanted to ask a few questions of Julian Assange's lawyer, Jennifer Robinson. She's been working on this case and very close to the family for the past 12 years. I met Jennifer in London when I was working on the extradition case, when they were trying to extradite Julian Assange to Sweden, and I met her then, so we've been friends since then. But disclaimer, even though we're friends doesn't mean we agree on every aspect of the case. We've had some good debates, but I wanted to get her take on a few key issues around Julian Assange's case. So we'll hear from her now. Jennifer Robinson, she's a barrister at Doughty Street Chambers in London, and she's acted in key human rights and media freedom cases in both domestic and international courts. And the first question that I had for her, I just said, look, did you think when you took on the case, we would end up here? You know, more than a decade down the track, your client has spent 7 years holed up in an embassy, another 3.5 in Belmarsh prison.
Hi everyone. First I want to thank the Wheeler Centre for hosting this event this evening, and to pay tribute to John, Julian's dad, for the amazing work that he's been doing for Julian around the world, and of course to Stella, his wife, for the amazing support that she is to him. If someone had asked me 12 years ago if we would be sitting here talking about this right now, that we'd seen Donald Trump as the president, that Julian would be facing 175 years in prison, I wouldn't have believed them. But unfortunately, that's where we are. Julian is a remarkable journalist who is in prison for publications for which he's won the Walkley Award for Most Outstanding Contribution to Journalism, for which he's won journalism awards the world over. And unfortunately, that's where we are today. And if someone had told me that 12 years ago when I first started working for Julian, I just wouldn't have believed them.
noise, a bit of music in the background. Jen, being the consummate professional she is, there was an event going on in her accommodation. She's overseas for work at the moment, but she ploughed through, to her credit. As she mentioned, Julian faces 175 years in jail because of acts of journalism. And you'll remember the vision from Collateral Murder, US forces in Iraq firing on civilians and Reuters journalists. After that, WikiLeaks published the Iraqi and Afghani war logs, the Guantanamo Bay files, and US State Department cables. He's been charged with 18 counts under the Espionage Act, which no publisher has ever been charged with before. So I asked Jen if she could explain to me what this entails and why the publishers he collaborated with, the New York Times, The Guardian, and Der Spiegel, were never charged. I asked her what strategy might be at play here.
Julian faces unprecedented charges under the Espionage Act, and as you rightly point out, Rachel, Julian is the only person that's facing charges. He's the first publisher and journalist in the history of the United States to ever face these kinds of charges. And it's important to remember that it wasn't just Julian and WikiLeaks that published this information. He published it together with media organisations around the world, Der Spiegel, The Guardian, The New York Times. And this is part of the problem. They are targeting and isolating Julian when really what they're doing is criminalising public interest journalistic practices that all of these media organisations partake in, just as Julian did. And to isolate Julian in this way, I think, is wrong in principle. And media organisations need to understand that this indictment criminalises the act of journalism and journalistic activity. So while Julian is being prosecuted alone in this case, the precedents being set will apply to every single one of these other organisations. But I do think that the precedent they're choosing to set with Julian should be seen as a warning to all other media organisations, but they're choosing to go for him first. And I think it's really important that we remember that this is going to cause problems for all other media organisations. It's not just Julian that's at risk here, it is the precedent that's being set for everyone everywhere. And it's not just about what it says about the United States, it's the precedent that it sets globally. So what message does this send to Russia or to China? You can extradite a journalist and a publisher for publishing truthful information about that country from another country. So any journalist anywhere in the world can be sought for extradition and prosecution for publishing truthful information about a foreign power. And we ought to be thinking carefully. This is the United States that's doing this, the country that represents itself as the bastion of free speech, as bringing democracy to the world. What message does that send to China and Russia?
And Australians might be thinking that this verges on the stuff that comes out of spy novels, but there was a CIA plot to capture and kill Julian Assange. It's been the security company at the Ecuadorian embassy conducted secret surveillance and allegedly handed it to US authorities. Now, I asked Jen about these tapes and recordings because they were of meetings with her, other lawyers, family members, campaign members, and I wondered how those conversations, especially the legally privileged conversations, could affect things.
There's been a huge amount of abusive process in this case, whether we talk about the surveillance by the CIA and by other governments, the abuse that is to interfere with our legally privileged communications. I've personally been spied on. I've had to sue the British government over it, about their information sharing with the United States. But we also have an open criminal investigation in Spain at the moment. And the revelations from Yahoo News about what has been happening, what the CIA had planned towards Julian, plots to kidnap, kill and capture him in London, trying to take the DNA of his children from their diapers, from their nappies. Really, the abuse of the intelligence agencies in this case is significant. And if we look back through history, we look, for example, about the prosecution of the Pentagon Papers leaker Daniel Ellsberg during the Nixon administration. Breaking into and stealing and surveilling his psychiatrist was sufficient to have the entire prosecution thrown out under Nixon. We've seen more than that in Julian's case. They have spied on his medical appointments, on us as his lawyers, on his family. They've seized legally privileged material from the embassy. How can he possibly have a fair trial in these circumstances? It interferes with his right to a defence. It interferes with my ability to do my job as a lawyer. And how can he possibly get a fair trial in these circumstances?
Now, Jen talks about a job there, and Julian Assange is in jail for the type of work that I and my colleagues do daily. So I put to her that if Julian Assange is jailed in the US, what does this mean for me as a journalist and for all of my colleagues?
As you point out, Rach, this case is not just about Julian, it's about you as a journalist and it's about all of your colleagues. If Julian goes to, the criminal investigation itself is already chilling national security journalism, and it's designed to send a message to every other whistleblower and journalist who may receive and publish information just as Julian has, to prevent them from doing their jobs and to scare them from doing their jobs. But what this precedent means is that any journalist anywhere in the world could be sought for extradition and prosecution for publishing truthful information about a foreign power. Now, whether that's the United States, whether it's Russia, whether it's China, whether it's Iran, this is a dangerous precedent. And it's a dangerous precedent, I think, even more so because we're talking about a democratic country, we're talking about our ally. This is journalistic practices that Julian sits in Belmarsh prison, a high-security prison. It's scary. Every journalist should appreciate that this affects them. It's why the Freedom of the Press Foundation calls it the most terrifying precedent in the 21st century. And I agree with them. It is. And all journalists ought to be seeing this as a threat to themselves and to their freedoms, and should be speaking out on Julian's behalf and asking questions of the Australian government and the United States government about what this case means and when this case will be dropped because of what it means for all of you.
Jen recently told the National Press Club that there needs to be an urgent political fix. So I asked her, has there been any kind of indication, and I'll be asking John Shipton as well, any indication from Prime Minister Anthony Albanese that he will act?
This case needs a political resolution. The legal process ahead could take many more years. Julian can't last that long, and he certainly cannot be extradited to the United States. Prime Minister Albanese has said that he will take action. This case has gone on too long. There's nothing served by Julian's continued incarceration. So we finally have a Prime Minister who is willing to raise this with the United States and has said that this case needs to end. We have been talking to successive governments for 12 years, as long as I've been working on this case. We've been asking the Australian government to do what Prime Minister Albanese is now saying he will do. But we need to hold the Australian government accountable to that. We need to make sure that they're asking these questions. It is entirely possible this case can be brought to an end. If the Australian government could bring home David Hicks, who was accused of terrorism offences, then we can bring home an Australian journalist and publisher who has won awards the world over, who is being prosecuted for journalism. The Australian government can do it. Prime Minister Albanese is committed to doing it, and we need to hold them accountable to that.
And we thank Jen Robinson for her contribution and pushing through some dancing that sounds like was going on in the background. Now, I'd like to introduce you to our very special guest tonight, John Shipton. He's the father of Julian Assange, an anti-war activist and retired builder. His fight to free his son from prison is the subject of the multi-award winning film Ithaca, A Father, a Family, a Fight for Justice. Welcome, John. Hi. Get comfy.
Oh.
Yeah, just bring it, yeah.
Hello. Hi, everybody.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you for the Wheeler Centre, and thank you very much for PEN. A special mention to a friend up the back there, Con. There he is.
John, I'd like to start with, if you could tell us when the last time was that you spoke to Julian, and the most important question, how's he doing?
You know, he rings me in the morning, so it's his late evening. So I can't work out whether he's a bit down or just plain tired. But I don't dare ask because he might say I'm down and what can I do about it? So I guess tell jokes. But I spoke to Julian this morning. It was about 6:15. He rang at 6:05, but I was in the shower. I got to the phone and dropped out of my wet hand, and he rang back at 7. the usual, like the phone rings when you're in the shower and it's important, so like, rush over to the sink where you put the phone to grab it. But I explained what's cooking here, and then also Gabrielle's in the United States. Ithaca had its premiere in the United States yesterday in New York City. I explained that. It's a good roll-up. And they're going to show Ithaca in Ithaca in New York. So it's sort of like, the planets coming into alignment.
I've noticed a similarity in you both already, a commitment to meticulous detail, which I love. Punctilio is always a bore, so I'll spend the rest of the evening making gross generalisations. You mentioned jokes, so I was going to ask you about that later, but do you try not to talk about the case? Is it important just keeping your spirits up?
Well, the case in detail is not my call, and also the case in detail is such a volume of information that it's very difficult to grasp. Last time I counted, there were 24 court cases that Julian's fought. I mean, really and truly, they're endless, and there's, I think, 3 more to go in this section. So that 24 is 27. It's hard to keep a bit track of but so I concentrate on the phenomenon of Julian Assange and the larger meaning, using Julian as an emblem of a collapse into barbarity, which I just use poetry to describe. So it goes something like, what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. So that describes, in poetic terms, what we see in Julian's matter as emblematic of what concerns us at the moment.
When you flew to London when he'd been arrested, and I understand you lost contact with Julian at a young age but came back into his life later in life, what made you reach out at the point that you did?
His mama, Christine, kept the contact going all those years, and then came to arrange a reunion, which happened, and since then it hasn't stopped in any way at all.
And you've mentioned Ithaca. For those of you who haven't watched it, it's a brilliant film. And you see John traipsing around Europe trying to build these coalitions of friendships with groups that might be able to help. And you get a very strong sense, and I think you talk about this in the film, of your interior conflict, your desire to help your child who, as you say, is in the shit, as you put it, but also not wanting attention, which is this inevitable byproduct of your campaign. And, I know you don't like the media much, and I'm part of that, so apologies for that. But I did want to ask how you're going, because you say in the film it's not going to get better, and that just made me so sad hearing that, because you just sounded like your soul was really tired.
No, a couple of things there that, I'm a shy man, so, that's the package, and we all grown-ups now, we know we come as a package with characteristics. But I do like a fight, so that capacity to fight overcomes, the other characteristics. And often in a family, you will notice as the years go by or the generations go by, a particular characteristic continually pops up. And in one phase or in one generation, it will be a burden. In another generation, it will be a great attribute. And we notice that as, among our kids and so on. The other aspect is that, I'm all right. I'm here talking to you. I've had a lovely meal at Moat's downstairs. And after we go from here, I'll have a whiskey and then stare out the window for a minute, as older people want to do. Julian is in a cell, it's this big. And he'd been in that for now over 3 years. Prior to that, he was in a room which was about this big for 7.5 years. So I'm okay. And I'm with you and all of the lovely faces that I look upon in each meeting, and the wonderful people that I meet, and the tremendous strength worldwide that is an inflowing tide, an upwelling of a hunger for justice and a revulsion at the sight of injustice. They're important things. And to be around that is no burden at all.
When you visit Julian, can you take me through the rigmarole of what you have to do even just to get in? And then are you allowed to hug him? How does it work?
Oh, God, they do carry on.
Yeah.
I mean, I was going in with that famous artist, A.Y. Wee, and he's that what we used to call in the olden days pike neck and build. I'm leptone, I'm long and skinny, he's short and thick. And, I watch him carefully as we go through this procedure. Take off your shoes, take off your belt, take off your cufflinks, make sure there's no paper, no threads. They snip the threads off because they might be dipped in what they call spice, which is a mixture of drugs that they try and smuggle into the jail. And I notice, he's not looking about. He shows no sign of nervous energy pulsing through his body and mind. He looks straight ahead. His eyes are even. His hand movements in getting undressed are slow and accurate. And I think, this man's got nerves of steel. And I go up to his ear and I said, you're doing well here, A.Y. So I've been through this a few times. Of course, as you know, he was jailed in China. So you go through all that fuss and bother, and then they line you up and the dogs come and sniff you. And then you go in, you get a piece of paper with a number on it, and the number is of the seating. So the seats go from 1 to 10 and A to H. And they give you the number and the row, and you look over and you see Julian there sitting in a seat. They'll have 3 seats in an arch and then 1 seat. He has to sit in that seat. You buy 3 cups of coffee. He likes to have 2. I like to have 1. And so I don't like those plastic cups much, so I always take the top off, and to drink it like that, the guard comes over and says, put the top back on, you're not allowed to have it. So, everything to subdue you to the, to remove any signal of humanity except the embrace. Yeah.
So you are allowed to hug him?
Yes, the embrace is the signal of humanity.
This is a really tough question for me to ask you, and I hope it doesn't upset you, but in the court case, the extradition court case, the court heard that this ends one of 2 ways for Julian, that he gets out or he dies by suicide in custody. That must be a devastating thing to hear as a father. What are your thoughts on how this is going to play out?
I don't let, I have this image when we studied at school anthropology of the, what did they call them? The medicine man of the village, having a shrunken skull on a stick, and hanging off that a number of even smaller shrunken skulls, which he goes up to the tribal members who are giving him a pain in the neck and shakes that totem at them, and they become docile from that. Well, I don't do fear. I don't do that. So when they mention, that Julian may, I just take no notice. I don't do that. In fact, what it does to me is makes me furious and bordering on rage, which I turn to an energy to evaluate the circumstance politically, to evaluate the circumstance socially, to look at the phenomenon. And I use those energies to go around the world, making people's ears bleed in some cases, I hope that's the answer.
Yeah, you channel it. How do you think Australia will see Julian Assange in 10 years, 25 years? There have been many political prisoners through history, and we know some of the bigger names, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, and you might say their sacrifices are worth it for the change they managed to effect or represent. But Julian has been in exile for so long. So I'm wondering what kind of outcome you or he would need to see to make it worth it.
Yeah, that's a good question. If you take the picture, the image of a society as soil from which within the nutritions shape the plant that grows there. Take that analogy and you apply it to Julian Assange. He grew from this soil here, from you as a collective, as a society. When you see and think of Julian Assange, you are thinking in the abstract, I don't mean, as you come up to Julian and shake hands. You're thinking of yourself. You're thinking of rather special qualities that exist here in this community. The same you would think of when you envision Gough Whitlam, for example, or Weary Dunlop, for example. So that's how Julian will be measured in the future, as fruit of this womb here. Just to add a little more and make the picture global, encompassing. In 1945, that catastrophe ended, and the people of the world gathered together and created a most magnificent civil structure and architecture ever made, and it was the United Nations. Its first president is another Assange-like, Gough-like, Dunlop-like, was Herbert Vere Everett. He was Minister of Foreign Affairs in the Chifley government. He, along with Eleanor Roosevelt, were the principal authors of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. A tremendous contribution. In 1973, the Conventions of Asylum, which began in 1958 to be assembled, were presented to the United Nations General Assembly and accepted with only 16 abstentions, all the rest voting for them, by, guess who? Australia. Here. So that quality that we have manifests itself through time, space, and through society and our contributions. I've left out the scientists, so you'll forgive me, there are many of great stature that we have produced.
And this campaign has gone on so long for you now, and you know, as the film really brings out just tireless campaigning, you, the family, everyone, all of his supporters. What is worrying is what you touched on in the past. There has been in the past a sense of Assange fatigue, you know, and even in the movie you hear someone on a talk show go, remind me what I think of that guy again, because this has gone on for so long. So I was wondering whether that surprises you, given what he sacrificed, that some people are so nonchalant about it. And also, does it worry you? You know, like, what's the danger if people do get sick of talking about Julian Assange?
Well, when you particularise, we get two things in there that are really interesting. One is the normalisation of an injustice. I can develop on that in two ways. First of all, is the impunity of institutions. We, all of us know, and it's reinforced by the revelations of WikiLeaks, Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning about the Iraq War. We, all of us know that that is a great war crime. Gideon Polyer, who works just over the road there in Melbourne University, a professor who studies excess deaths, estimates that there are 6 to 7 million direct deaths as a result of the last 20 years, the United States and its allies, or Washington, I rather say, destroying 7.5 countries. We know this. It stinks in the nostrils. You can smell it, it's like ammonia. We know it. So the normalisation of Julian's circumstance is overcome by the gradual understanding moving through us that this circumstance must change. And so now, in the last poll, 88% of Australians want Julian Assange brought home. In the last election, every successful candidate in the Teals stood on an Assange platform. The Greens stood on an Assange platform and quadrupled their House of Representatives representation. The Prime Minister stood on an Assange platform and led his cohort, the ALP, to government. That is adamantine politics, hard as diamond, that we made a change. And it rises up. I also think, of course, that all genius arises through the mass, as do these movements. And if I can riff on this for a second, the Council of Europe has made a declaration that Julian Assange is a protected journalist and must be freed. The Human Rights Commission of the Council of Europe has made a similar declaration. The United Nations Human Rights Commissioner has made a similar declaration. The Austrian government has made a parallel declaration. The Canton of Geneva has offered Julian a humanitarian visa, which was confirmed by the Federation of Switzerland. The Bundestag has made Julian Assange an official agenda item in the United States-Germany friendship group, which must be discussed between the United States and Germany every 3 months. Every single parliament in the European theatre has an Assange cross-party group. Some of them, like Greece, have 90 out of 300 parliamentarians. The Australian parliamentary group is now around 50 people, cross-party group. We'll meet them next Monday, I think it is. We're going up to Canberra. There are 800,000 signatories to the Bring Assange Home petition, 450,000 in the German petition, 350,000 in the English petition. At the moment, Ithaca has had 30 exhibitions in Germany. Last couple of months ago, Gabrielle and I did a Q&A tour of 30 in the United Kingdom. In February, we'll do 45 across the United States. We did 5 tours in the east coast of Australia, everyone well attended. In the United States, we did a tour across the United States. In Oakland's, over 1,000 people crowded into the hall and gave us, as we walked out the door, $14,000 cash, handy money for a pensioner on the road. I hope that I've given you some impression of what this thing is that we here in Australia originated, the first 2 in the Australian Parliament of any parliamentarians anywhere. And I rarely name personalised politics, I just don't do it. But in this case, forgive me if I do, but they're Andrew Wilkie and Peter Whish-Wilson, both of whom were vigorous in the David Hicks case as well. It's tremendous, and it's worldwide, and I think I start to feel that it symbolises a discontent with the ruination of the United Nations, that magnificent civil creation, or the ruination of the Conventions of Asylum, or the ruination of the Geneva Conventions. We don't like that. And so we use Julian as an emblem. And when I mentioned to you that there are, according to Gideon Polyer, the direct deaths of 6 to 7 million people, the bereavement, can you imagine that exists as a thundercloud over the Middle East? Brown University, 36 million refugees in the Middle East looking for homes. Why? Because their communities have been destroyed. We go some way towards acknowledging that grief and bringing it to an end by our energies in bringing Julian home, because it's emblematic. He published the Iraq War files, and they hold there for us to inspect. I know that's a burden on the consciousness, you know, all of these tragic things. But in them, there is like an acorn seed. Small things from little things grow. The Kev Carmody's great song. and I'll give you, if you like, a couple of examples. They'll be quick. So in 2008, outside Baghdad, a group of American soldiers broke into a house and murdered the whole family, the mum and dad and the babies and the brothers and girls and boys and aunties, uncles and grandfather, all of them. Thinking they'd get into trouble for this heinous crime, they called in an airstrike and obliterated from the earth the house and that family forever. That was published in a cable by the United States ambassador to Iraq and was sent to the Department of State in Washington. That was among the cables that WikiLeaks published and was read by the parliamentarians, the bureaucrats and the people of Iraq, that ruined, that smashed nation, gathered up their courage upon reading that cable and refused to sign the Status of Forces Agreement, which meant that the United States had to remove all of its servicemen, and Australia too, all of the Allies, from Baghdad. It brought an end to a war and began the process, slow though it is, of bringing about peace. So the internals create that we see the externals and they appall us naturally. And we see the internals, and we see there, in all of that, a seed of a new beginning and bringing an end to a war. It's rather magnificent, huh? I'll give you another quickie. The Chagos Islanders, you might know it as an American Air Force base in the Indian Ocean. Diego Garcia. The Chagos Islanders were all gathered up and dumped by the United Kingdom in Mauritius, every one of them. The cables, 250,000 cables in the cable set, every single one of them will bring a benefit to somebody somewhere in the understanding of what their circumstances are. The Chagos Islanders read the cable. Their lawyers brought a case to the International Court of Justice in which they prevailed against the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom appealed. They prevailed again. Magnificent, huh? Justice. Guantanamo Bay files. The great Australian lawyer Stephen Kenny, defending David Hicks, used, along with another American lawyer named Clive Stafford Smith, who established a NGO called Reprieve. They used those files to bring justice to some of the men falsely incarcerated in Guantanamo Bay and brought David Hicks home to his family. Another magnificent. So within that circumstance that embraces the consciousness and gives an unpleasant weight upon the soul, look into it a little and you will see that within that they are great gifts and they have stopped conflagrations which were destroying communities, nations and people.
I know, John, you're very keen to hear from some of the people who have come to support you tonight, so we might take some questions from the floor. We've got about 10 minutes left. Does anyone have a question for John? I mean, I do have more, but I've...
You can ask me anything, you know, like...
There's some microphones coming around.
Question for you, John. How's Stella holding up? You know, I mean, it's like her dream marriage, was
I don't know, she loves him, you know, that's her thing. And, you know, I live in that house and, you know, she gets up and dresses the kids and gives them breakfast and walks around like that, you know why, the phone's under answers the calls as they come in, and she has a special phone ring for Julian, which she sort of keeps with her all the time. Dresses the kids, gets them out the door, down to school, 20 minutes walk away, walks back and gets out the computer, sits it up there, and away she goes. That's and then on visiting days, I think they're allowed twice a week, but they're very strict in the United Kingdom about school attendance, and if you don't attend school, welfare comes around, knocks on the door. So then she dashes off to see Julian and dashes off to see, she's a lawyer herself, and then attends to her mum and dad. Her dad's 91, I think, and a woman by the name of General Sands, she calls herself, published her mum and dad's address on the internet in Barcelona the other day, and her dad's 90, you know, and her mum is, well, mature, and that's a worry for her. So yeah, so that's her day. Yeah. Yeah, she loves Julian. What can I say? You know, actually, that's a beautiful story. In the, you know, the marriage was in a room about this big, and there was sort of me and her mum and Gabrielle and the two kids and her brother and the celebrant and 4 guards. Around the wall, at about this height, they have the emergency buttons. It's a prayer room. We weren't allowed in the chapel itself for some reason or other, but this is called a prayer room, and there's these emergency buttons. And if you're a kid, what's the biggest fun to do is push a button that drives the adults mad. So anyway, the point I want to make in the face of such, I don't know, perverted circumstances and injustice, it was just a joy to see love grow and then give fruit. Yeah.
Before I take any more questions, is Stella on the line? Oh, fantastic. Okay, is there a question in the meantime?
Yeah, look, my name's Peter Byrne. I'm a journalist with the World Socialist website. I'd like to thank PEN and Jennifer and John for very important comments. Just before I ask the question, I wanted to explain that 100,000 car workers in the United States recently received a letter defending Julian Assange's freedom, sent by the World Socialist website endorsed candidate for president of the United Auto Workers Union, a man by the name of Will Lehman. Just briefly, one of the things he said in this letter to the 100,000 car workers, he said, "I'm writing to you today on another matter that is critical to the interest of all workers in the United States and throughout the world. That is the case of Julian Assange, currently imprisoned in the UK and facing extradition to the US, where he would be prosecuted under the Espionage Act. He could receive a 175-year sentence or even be executed. Assange is being persecuted for one reason and one reason alone. He revealed the truth about the actions of the American government abroad, the same government that represents the corporations that exploit us here in the US. It is critical that all workers take a stand in defence of Julian Assange. It will not be through appeals to the ruling elite and their politicians that his freedom will be secured, but only through our intervention. We must connect the fight to defend our interests with the defence of Assange, the defence of democratic rights and opposition to war." End quote. Yes, so I think it was important to bring that to the meeting, you know, the dissemination of the campaign to defend Julian throughout the car workers in the United States. My question to John is, with the parliamentary group and so on, what's their sort of next moves, or what have they got planned that you can tell us about?
Well, there's a delegation going to Washington. It's an international delegation of parliamentarians and some representatives from the group who are going on that. We're having a meeting, of the group on Monday. So from that, that's the first meeting of the group after the election. So from that, we'll formulate what can be done, and no doubt it'll be on the Assange campaign website. Thanks for your question, by the way.
I think we're quite lucky to have Stella Assange on the line at the moment, the wife of Julian Assange, and also she started, for many of you who don't know, started working at WikiLeaks, and that's where they met. Hi Stella, really lovely to meet you. No?
Hi, apologies for joining at the end. I had some technical difficulties, but I'm just arriving at Belmarsh. Maybe you can see.
Oh yeah, we can. How long do we have you for?
About 10 minutes.
Okay. We were just hearing about your wedding, and I was curious as to, they say that you can't help who you love, and I was wondering what attracted you to Julian, and knowing what you know now, whether you would do anything different, because it's been a rough road for you.
Well, I wouldn't change anything. We fell in love because Julian is the most amazing person I've ever met. He's incredibly caring, brilliant mind, and we love each other. So it's the world around us that's made things difficult. Our relationship is concerned. I couldn't be happier to be with, the most amazing man in the world. But he's been inside Belmarsh for almost, it will be 4 years in April. And obviously it's difficult for us, being forced apart for almost 4 years. But we're able to see each other about once or twice a week. So today's unusual because I saw him on Sunday, and so it's quite unusual to see him with so little time in between. But we speak on a daily basis most days, unless there's some problem with the.
Yeah, there was a really nice moment in Ithaca when one of your sons sung "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star," and I was wondering what's the cost to them?
Well, it's incalculable, right? They need their father. They're asking when he'll come home, and I don't have an answer for them other than soon. And they don't have a real understanding of the terrible possibilities that may lie ahead, but we stay positive and tell them that he'll come home soon and that we're fighting to get him home, and many people all around the world are fighting for his freedom, and they can see it too. I mean, we had this action on the 8th of October around the UK Parliament. It was a very ambitious and a bit of a gamble to try to wrap around Parliament holding hands. And many of you will know that the UK Parliament is on the River Thames, so that meant we had to cross the bridges and all of the South Bank. And we calculated we needed 5,000 people, and of course, we didn't really know whether we would be successful or not until we arrived on the day. And there had been a train strike called for that day, but people showed up in spades, and we had many more than the 5,000 required to do the hands around Parliament. So the kids were there for that action, and they see, how loved Julian is, how much support he has, and I tell them that people all around the world are fighting for him.
As someone that has been so intimately involved in WikiLeaks for so long, I'm curious to pick your brain about, as an investigative journalist, I'm fascinated in the technology, the Dropbox kind of architecture that allows people to secretly pass on information. And I was wondering, could WikiLeaks have kept publishing without a figurehead? Do you think Julian's problems might have started because he gave WikiLeaks a face, which then became a target?
Well, I've always been, involved on the legal end, but Julian did try to remain anonymous. He made huge effort to not become a lightning rod. So you often see this WikiLeaks co-founder, but he's the founder, but basically it's him. But obviously there have always been other people involved, and the problem was that some of the other people who were involved wanted more public-facing roles and started taking credit for things that they didn't have if you don't take credit, then other people will. That's part of the problem. And so eventually he was kind of forced to come out and leave. That's, the nature of order. In 2010, you'll remember that there was a lot of attempts to kind of tell him to step down, that he shouldn't leave WikiLeaks and so on, part of the political attack. And there were others waiting in the wings to kind of take over and do something, take WikiLeaks in a different direction. Maybe not who were not as brave or who were more friendly to the U.S. government and that kind of thing. So it's a curse, certainly. Julian's never he doesn't seek fame, or he's not that kind of person, and he's definitely suffered.
Sorry, I asked this of John as well. How will you? How do you think the world will see Julian Assange in 10 years, 25 years from now? What needs to happen for you, Stella, and Julian to make all this worth it? Or do you think it has been worth it already?
Well, Julian has published, the truths that have been hidden that have been covered up. He's revealed state actors committing war crimes. He's revealed the records of the innocent victims of war. So, no, it's not really fair to say, well, yeah, it's all worth it, because this shouldn't be happening. Julian did nothing wrong, basically. the situation needs to be urgently corrected by those who have facilitated it, and that includes the Australian government, who has to free Julian, basically. Julian has been, imprisoned for years for doing nothing wrong at all, because the US is persecuting him. And the Australian government basically Julian's life lies in the hands of the Australian government. They are the ones who are in a position to get him out. I know Albanese met with Biden, I think yesterday or the day before, and he needs to get Julian out. That's part and parcel of being the Prime Minister of Australia. It's taking the necessary steps to ensure that an Australian journalist, Australian publisher is not imprisoned for doing his job. It's a failure that it hasn't happened yet, that Julian hasn't been freed yet. And I have all, at the same time, as I say, Julian's life isn't in the hands of the Albanese government. I mean, it's that simple.
I do have a couple more questions for you, but I just want to check that you're not waiting to go in, because I know how precious your time is.
I have about 3 minutes. I have to check in and do all the bureaucratic stuff.
We've heard about the rigmarole.
So on.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask how you were holding up, really. As a wife, a mother, the last couple of years would have been really tough for you all. And I asked the same question of John, but we heard in court that this will end one of two ways for Julian Assange, and I just wonder how, what do you do with that?
Well, you fight for the people you love, and you fight and you fight and you fight, right? And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to fight until he's free. And we've seen the incredible support growing over time. Julian was one of the 3 finalists for the Sakharov Prize here in the European Parliament. It's a peak human rights freedom of thought prize that the European Parliament as a whole gives, and he was one of the 3 finalists. And that sends a very clear message that Julian is a political prisoner, that the situation is completely unsustainable. And it's great. It's great that the European Parliament is nominating Julian for their peak human rights and freedom of thought prize. And there are many such initiatives all over the place, and it's really important that they keep coming, because that's how you fight a political case. You keep it on people's mind. You ensure that there's cultural, political awareness, and that the expectation is that he has to be free, not that he remains in jail. Every day that he's in prison is a day of deeper injustice and of failure by those who are who should solve this situation. So anyway, I'm completely involved in the fight, and while you're in the fight, you're okay because you have a purpose, and the only purpose I have is to bring Julian home to his children, to me.
Well, I'll let you go because I know how precious your time is, but thank you so much for joining us tonight. I wish you all the best.
Thanks.
Have a good day, Stella.
Bye.
That was very lucky that she was able to join us tonight, but I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us, and thank you very, very much, John, for your wonderful words.
Just may I just give thanks to you for rocking up and for your support, and I think pretty close to winning this game. Thanks.